Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of our Dark History series and it's part 2 of the Josef Mengele Angel of Death series of videos. I was so glad to see that you guys really enjoyed and got a lot out of the first video. I was very nervous before posting it because it was a little bit different than what we usually do, but I was really excited and happy that you guys enjoyed it and you welcomed the change in our content. So for today's video, if you thought that part 1 was going to be upsetting, and it was upsetting in many cases, part 2 gets a lot more in-depth into what Mengele does once he's at Auschwitz, and it is upsetting. So once again, if you feel the need to take a break, I don't blame you. I also needed to take some breaks while researching this. Before we get started, I do want to talk about our sponsor for today's video, and it's Mengele TV. Mengele TV is one of our most loyal and welcome sponsors. It's a documentary streaming service, and for today's video, I want to recommend a corresponding documentary on Mengele TV. Throughout the entire time I was recording part 1, I had to hold myself back from saying Nazis, like Brad Pitt did in Inglourious Basterds. So the documentary I want to suggest for you today on Mengele TV is The Real Inglourious Basterds. This is the incredible story behind Quentin Tarantino's film, and even if you're not interested in history or World War II, I still think you'll get a lot out of it and you will enjoy it. Mengele TV has over 2,000 documentary films and series. They're adding more every single week. There's a bunch of new ones that just came out that I can't wait to watch. They have another documentary called The Day When Hitler Lost the War. They have another documentary called After the Holocaust. And after watching this video, if you have Mengele TV, I would definitely go and watch Inside Hitler's Killing Machine, because this documentary recounts the discovery of Adolf Hitler's Nazi death camps, which were meticulously designed to kill on a scale never before seen in the history of humanity. So it really corresponds well with what we're talking about today, and if you want to learn more, I think it would be a really good companion documentary to watch. I love Mengele TV and I'm always finding new things that I want to watch on it. I love that I can stream it on my tablet, my phone, my computer, my Roku, my smart TV. I love that I can keep watching a documentary and pick up right where I left off on a different device. Right now, Mengele TV is offering viewers of Stephanie Harlowe a free 1-month trial. You can go in the description box and click the link and sign up for your free trial. At the end of the trial, you can cancel. You're not tied into anything. There's no contracts, but I really don't think you're going to want to cancel because there's so much stuff on there. You're not going to be able to watch it all in a month. Remember, if you do sign up for Mengele TV, to contact me on Twitter or Instagram or in the comments of this YouTube video and let me know what you're watching and what you think, because I really do like hearing about what you guys are watching and be able to chat with you about it if I've seen the same thing. Thank you guys so much for listening to the sponsor, and on to the video. Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz, eager to start his human experiments and make a name for himself in this new world where actual science wasn't a factor in scientific research. But he wasn't the first to use concentration camp prisoners in scientific experiments. By 1939, standards in medical ethics in Nazi Germany no longer existed. And he wasn't the first medical professional, if you can call him that, to abuse his power. At Buchenwald, Nazi doctors had already been injecting prisoners with typhus fever, which was an ailment that had been causing a lot of casualties for the German army. They used these prisoners to infect them, make them sick, and then inject them with random serums and concoctions to see if they could cure them. But not for the sake of the prisoners, for the sake of the German army. What they wanted to do was find a cure for typhus fever so that they could give it to the German army and they would stop losing soldiers. Other camps saw doctors infecting patients with cholera, yellow fever, diphtheria, and smallpox, all in the name of finding a cure for the Aryan race. And at Auschwitz, the largest of all the camps, Dr. Horst Schumann had already been exposing prisoners to large doses of radiation to discover if this could become a more efficient method of sterilization as opposed to the slower method of operating. Many of these people died as a result or were killed because the radiation burns had made them unfit for work. Auschwitz in southern Poland was a complex made up of over 40 buildings with 3 main camps: a prison camp, a forced labor camp, and an extermination camp that was opened in 1940. Initially, the camps had been designed to hold political opponents of the Nazi regime, an order that had been given by Hitler 2 weeks after he took power in 1933. Here, these prisoners would be re-educated with physical and psychological torture. These were typically Germans who just hadn't seen the light yet, so they usually wouldn't be killed because their pure blood was too precious. They just needed to be forced to see things the right way. But after 1935's Nuremberg laws, Nazis began sending Jewish people to these camps. The first was Dachau, outside of Munich. 3 years later, the higher-ups considered this camp to be such a success that they replicated it, creating Sachsenhausen outside of Berlin. Here's where things began to escalate. Himmler himself personally designed the camp with the help of an architect and claimed it would be the most modern, adaptable camp ever built. It was constructed during the 1936 Olympic Games, which were held in Berlin. So while this death camp was being built, the world celebrated with Germany, just 20 miles away. Sachsenhausen would become a training camp for SS officers to visit and learn how these places were run, and when they completed their training, they'd be sent off to control their own camps. Sachsenhausen is where executions evolved. The Nazis had already been killing people, as many as they could. There were squads made up of SS members called Einsatzgruppen, which would act as mobile killing units, following behind the German army, and they were tasked simply with murdering anyone who was identified as a threat to the Third Reich. And by 1939, these units had systematically killed off 50,000 people, many of them Jews, as well as Roman Catholic clergy and Polish nobility. By 1941, their ranks multiplied, and so did the number of corpses they left in their wake. They alone were responsible for the death of 1.5 million Jews. 34,000 of them happened all at once in a massacre at Baba Yar in the Ukraine. Over a 36-hour period on September 29th and September 30th, the Einsatzgruppen lined women, men, and children up on the edge of a large ravine and used machine guns to kill them all, afterwards covering their bodies with dirt and rocks to hide their crimes. In January of 1939, Adolf Hitler gave a speech where he used the word extermination for the very first time in public, and his words were answered by thundering applause. 9 months later, the Nazis invaded Poland, triggering World War II. They set up a Nazi government in the country, and they were happy to have the territory. The only problem was there were too many Jewish people. Poland was home to the biggest Jewish population in all of Europe. Between the years of 1939 and 1945, 12,000 ghettos were created. Prisoners of war would be forced to go and live there so they could be separated from the general public. The ghettos weren't quite as bad as concentration camps, but the conditions there were awful. And add to that these people were being removed from their homes, their legitimate homes that they'd purchased, and Nazis were being moved into their houses, and they were being put into these horrible ghettos where there was no sanitation, running water, not enough food for everybody. Because there wasn't enough food or clean water or sanitation, diseases ran rampant. The occupants of these ghettos were kept in a holding pattern. The Nazis basically said, you stay here until we figure out what we're going to do with you. But they already knew what they were going to do with them. In December of 1939, the Nazis began working on Operation T4. 2 months prior, Adolf Hitler had signed a euthanasia order, giving his underlings permission to go ahead and murder every physically or mentally handicapped person they could find. These poor people were taken in vans, told they were going to a hospital where they would receive medical care, and then shoved into showers where they would be assaulted by a lethal dose of gas. But this system wasn't created overnight. The Nazis first needed a trial run to prove that this could work. And their first attempt was a baby boy named Gerhard Kretschmar. Gerhard's father brought him to the doctors shortly after he was born blind and with other physical disabilities, and requested that the monster, as he referred to him, be put to sleep. At first, he was told that they couldn't do it. This was illegal. But he filed a petition, and as soon as the petition hit Hitler's desk, he signed off on the killing of this child, calling it a mercy killing. This happened in August of 1938, and by 1939, 6 extermination centers had been established in psychiatric hospitals. And 1,000 children under the age of 17 were murdered there. Not all of these children's parents were as complicit or as evil as Gerhard's parents. The Nazis had lied to them and said that their children were being sent to special hospitals to receive the help that they needed. But in my opinion, knowing the Nazis, knowing what they stood for, they were very vocal. They didn't try to hide what they believed in, that they wanted to remove all of the weak from Germany. These parents most likely knew what the fate of their children would end up being. Operation T4 was created for multiple reasons, but here's just a few of the most ridiculous ones. Killing people was what the Nazis needed to do, but currently they were forced to do it face to face. The killing squads, day in and day out, would be murdering people at a very high rate, and this included women and children, babies. Many of them became depressed. Many of them went crazy. Many of them even took their own lives. Additionally, the methods that they were using to get rid of these people, it wasn't fast enough. It wasn't expedient enough. So it was inefficient for an end goal of taking out millions of people. They needed to find a way to reach their goal without putting the fragile Nazis in a bad mental state. In April of 1940, Auschwitz opened, and the first 40 prisoners who were sent there were criminals from Sachsenhausen. And when I say criminals, I don't mean political opponents or people that the Nazis deemed not worthy of life. I mean real, legit, violent criminals. German men who had committed actual crimes and had been in prison for them. They were not sent to Auschwitz to be imprisoned or tortured or murdered. They were sent there to set up the camp's police force because these prisoners would become the capos. They would essentially be the leadership structure at Auschwitz right under the SS officers. Yes, you heard that right. The Nazis put actual violent criminals in charge of completely innocent people because they were of pure German blood. Therefore, by default, they were better and more trustworthy than those who hadn't committed actual crimes, but were not of pure German blood. As I said, at first these camps were designed for forced labor. They didn't view these people as legitimate German citizens, but they weren't ignorant to the fact that they had at their disposal an entire workforce for free. In 1942, Auschwitz III was opened, and it housed the IG Farben factory. Now, the Nazis had already gone through the actual town of Auschwitz and removed all of its Jewish occupants, placing them in the ghettos. The town went from being a mainly Jewish town of 12,000 people to a strictly Nazi town of about 40,000, many of them being German engineers and their families. Slave labor from the concentration camp was used to keep the town up, keep it clean, do repairs and improvements if need be. Slave labor from the camps was also used at the IG Farben factory. Now, IG Farben at that point made rubber, essentially, but they also produced chemicals, one of them being Zyklon B. The chemical that would later be used to kill the very same people who were being forced to make it. If you're from the United States, like me, IG Farben may not sound familiar to you, but Bayer should. The recognizable aspirin still advertised and sold today. Not only did they use these people to make their products without any compensation, but the IG Farben factory had its own camp where they conducted experiments on prisoners they purchased from Auschwitz. In letters found that hold correspondence between the company and Auschwitz, IG Farben requests 150 women to be used to test a new sleeping pill they were working on. They paid 170 Reichsmarks for these prisoners, and when every single one of them died, IG Farben wrote to Auschwitz requesting more. In January of 1942, Reinhard Heydrich called a meeting with all the top-level Nazis. The order of business on the table: how to kill every single Jewish person in occupied Europe, roughly 11 million people. And now they knew how they could do it. In September of 1941, Rudolf Höchst's assistant, Karl Frisch, was left alone at Auschwitz while Höchst attended business elsewhere. And he got bored, as kids often do when they're left home alone. So this psychopath decided to fill his time and amuse himself with trying to kill people. He took a group of prisoners to the basement of Block 11 and gassed them with Zyklon B, a chemical that had previously been used to clean the bunkers and the prisoners' clothes every 3 months. Zyklon B would be in a tablet form, but when it was introduced to water and heat, it would release hydrogen cyanide. The test was considered to be a success, and it became the new method for the Third Reich to kill without having to get too close. This super secret meeting where they sat around and sipped coffee and had secretaries taking notes on how to kill 11 million people. The method that Karl Frisch had used was brought up. It was put on the table, and they were like, hey, this is gonna work. And everybody was like, yeah, sure, sign the paper and let's go get a drink. And it was named Operation Reinhard because who doesn't want their name attached to a plan that's gonna kill as many people as possible? Before Operation Reinhard, there was some killing going on in the concentration camps, but these were prisoners being shot or hung, a way to make an example out of them to other prisoners to stay in line. And prisoners died every day from not having clean water, not having enough food, or becoming sick. But mainly the Nazis had an interest in keeping them alive because they were using them as forced labor. But within 3 months of the meeting that discussed Operation Reinhard, 3 other camps were hastily built, secret camps. And these weren't labor camps. These were strictly death camps. That was their main purpose. In the existing camps, they adjusted their protocol and their operations to run much in the same way. So by the time Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in the spring of 1943, the camp was seeing trains arriving daily, and daily selections would quickly follow. During these selections, the medical staff at the camp would stand and inspect people as they got off the train, and they would tell them to get into one line or the other line. 20% of the people arriving were spared, mainly men, the young, and those who were healthy and strong enough to work, but the majority of these people were dead within 3 hours of arriving at the camp. Most of these people were the old, the sick, women who were pregnant, women with children. The children were always sent right to the gas chambers because the Nazis had no use for those who needed caring for. These people had no idea what was going to happen to them when they got off the trains. Loudspeakers were announcing to them that the camp had a bad case of typhus going around, so they were going to be split up and disinfected. Leave your luggage. You can get it later. Their luggage, their belongings, whatever pieces of their life they'd been able to pack away before being pulled from their homes was left behind as they were walked to their deaths. And the Nazis would go through their things later, pulling out anything that could be given to a good German citizen and throwing everything else into the fire. Family pictures, heirlooms, little stuffed bears and wooden toys. The things that were left of these people went up in flames. In the documentary, One Day in Auschwitz, Holocaust survivor Kitty Hart recalls what it was like to arrive at the camp in 1943 when she was a young teenager. She says, quote, "When we got there, we saw ghost-like figures with shaved heads, staggering in tattered clothes with great big eyes, screaming in all different languages, being beaten, and we thought, my God, is this what's going to happen to us? Suddenly, there was a weird stench, and the closer we got, the worse the stench became. And my mother said, 'What a curious place. Can you smell? Can you smell roasting meat?' And I said, 'Yes, I can.' And she said, 'Do you think they're roasting chicken here this time of night?' What Kitty and her mother were smelling was not roasted chicken. It was the bodies of those before them who'd already been killed in the gas chambers and were now being fed into huge incinerators in order to burn the evidence. Families were separated, violently torn apart, and they would never see each other again. If you were one of the 20% that was chosen to go to the work camp, you'd be stripped and smeared with a green substance to disinfect you. You would then be showered, and your head would be shaved, and you'd be tattooed with a number, and you'd become that number. You were no longer a person. You no longer had a name or a past. You'd be given a tattered prison uniform, a pair of wooden shoes, and a bowl. That was it. That's all you had now. People would constantly be collapsing and dying around you. There wasn't ever enough food. There wasn't ever enough clean water. And it would depend on your place in the line when you went to get your food, whether or not you got anything at all. They were forced to work 12 to 13 hours a day with no breaks. And usually they did this on empty stomachs, extremely dehydrated. Roll call was at 4 a.m. You'd be woken up by whistles and loudspeakers shouting for everybody to get outside. And you'd have to rush outside where there's nothing but mud and grime everywhere. One of the survivors of Auschwitz claims that there was just no grass anywhere. It was just all a wasteland. And if anybody did find a blade of grass, you'd eat it. Her first night in Auschwitz, Kitty Hart met a Romani woman who was staying in her barracks with her. And this woman read Kitty's palm and said that she was going to make it out. The next morning, this woman was cold. She died in the night. So they stripped her. They took all her clothes because they were cold. It was freezing there. And Kitty realized that this was really the only way you could survive. Just focus on doing whatever you needed to do that day to make it to the next day. Now, Josef Mengele, he loved the selection. Many of the other Nazi doctors, they weren't such a big fan of it. They really didn't like the process of having to be the one to decide who ended up staying alive and who was killed immediately. But Mengele made sure to be front and center every time a train arrived with more prisoners. He'd even switch shifts with other doctors to make sure that he was there every time. Those who arrived on the trains, terrified and confused, would be greeted by Mengele's smiling face. He was always smiling, always cheerful. Like little Beppo in the town of Günzburg, who all the townspeople said was just the most good-natured, kind-hearted child ever, Mengele put that image forth to the people that were now coming to the concentration camps. Something else they noticed about this smiling Nazi doctor was how clean and put together he always was, and that was hard in a place like Auschwitz where it literally was just mud and dirt and dust everywhere because it was raining, because there was construction constantly going on. It was just a filthy place, but he always looked pristine. Mengele showed up to the selections looking like he had just stepped off the pages of Nazi men's Vogue. Not a hair out of place, clean white gloves, impeccably pressed SS uniform, and his shoes were even shiny. Moishe Offer, who arrived at Auschwitz with his family in 1944, remembers the first time he saw Mengele. He said, quote, "He stood there tall, nice looking, and he was dressed very well as if he wanted to make a good impression. He had very soft hands, and he made fast decisions." Another child who managed to survive Mengele said much of the same. Eva Kupis said, quote, "My first impression of Mengele was that he was so nice-looking, very nice-looking." And you'll hear this sometimes from people who met Mengele at Auschwitz and managed to survive him. They'll say how handsome he was, how good-natured he was. So handsome, so charming. He should have been an actor. They said sometimes he was more handsome than an actor. I think somebody said he was more handsome than Cary Grant. As he always had, he exhibited his controlling nature through his appearance. And he would make the selection between life and death, often with a small little smile on his face, sometimes humming or whistling his favorite classical music piece. The Blue Danube Waltz was his favorite. The only time he showed more than a cursory interest in these people as he sorted them left or right with a flick of his manicured finger was when an interesting specimen came across his path, mainly twins. Alex Deckel, who arrived at Auschwitz with his mother when he was 13, said this, quote, "Dr. Mengele was standing at the head of the selection line. He noticed me immediately because I didn't look Jewish. I had very blonde hair and blue eyes, and I was in excellent physical shape. When he started talking to me, I answered in fluent German. He wasn't only looking for twins, he wanted triplets, midgets, hunchbacks, any unusual types, even people like me, Jews, who looked perfect Aryans. He asked me to step out of the line. I looked around for my mother, but she disappeared." Through the selection, one word would be ringing out, twins. Twins, I'm looking for twins. But no one knew if being a twin was a good thing or a bad thing. Twins would be separated from their parents, who would immediately be sent to the gas chambers. If the twins were babies or very young, sometimes Mengele would allow their mothers to remain with them, but not very often. Hedva and Leah Stern, 13-year-old girls who arrived with their mother, remembered that their mother was intent on keeping them all together. And as she heard the request for twins echoing around them, she hid her daughters under her skirts. But at the very last minute, she told them to go to Dr. Mengele and that she would reunite with them after. She told them, "Wait for me, children. We'll meet again by the gate." Later, the girls searched for their mother, who'd been wearing a beautiful black dress with pink strawberries on it. They cried and they watched the gate waiting for her to appear. But finally, the head of their barracks brought them over to the window and pointed to the crematorium that seemed to be running 24 hours a day, belching dark smoke into the sky, turning the air a sickly red color. They were told, "I can tell you now that your mother and the rest of your family went to the gas chamber." The twins would be held at Birkenau, the death camp at Auschwitz, and their barracks butted right up against the crematorium. The twins that Mengele snatched out of the selection line would often be the only children that would survive that selection. And the first thing they saw as they were being walked through the camp were these people walking around as if in a dream, so gaunt and pale that they resembled corpses, but the children knew that they weren't corpses because there were plenty of real corpses laying around. Once they were gathered up, the twins would be showered and branded as well, but they were allowed to wear their own clothes, and they were allowed to keep their hair. Mengele never allowed anybody to shave the heads of his twins. He was very interested in their hair, the color of it, the texture of it. He liked it done in a certain way. And he also wanted their lives at Auschwitz to remain as normal as possible. Because of these differences in their appearance, the children were immediately recognized as Mengele's children. And the SS guards and the capos knew that if they hurt these kids or if anything happened to these kids on their watch, they'd be held to pay. And for the most part, these children were generally well treated as you can be in a concentration camp, I suppose. They were given better food. They were given more food. They weren't beaten or punished for small indiscretions such as stealing food, something a normal prisoner would probably be shot for. But nothing could make these children feel as if life was normal. They were alone. Their families were dead. They'd lost everything. Nothing was okay. And their conditions, although better than most, were still subpar. They slept on hard wooden bunks with no pillows, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed. Eva Moses, who was there with her twin sister, remembered the experience very well. She said, quote, "That first night we went into the latrines. They were just holes in the ground with no running water. Everything stank. I remember seeing 3 dead children on the ground. Later, we would always find dead children on the floor of the latrines." Like I said, Mengele relished his position at Auschwitz. He'd been put in charge of the medical unit and the staff, but he really didn't have much to do there. They had this hospital ward, but it was a sham hospital. They weren't helping anybody. They would send sick people there, and the Nazi doctors and nurses, they just kill them. They weren't healing anybody. They weren't making anybody better. He didn't have much to do, essentially, because he wasn't being a real doctor. Essentially, the doctors' jobs at the concentration camps were to give medical and scientific legitimacy to these selections, and that's why at least one of them always had to be present. Other Nazis, including other Nazi doctors, they didn't want to work at the concentration camps. It was the last place they wanted to be. They were sent there, but unwillingly. Mengele wanted to go to Auschwitz. He asked. He finagled his way into the position. And he'd shown a vigor and excitement in performing his duties. A report by one of his superiors, written after Mengele had been at Auschwitz for several months, stated that Mengele showed maturity and strength, and displayed no weakness in character or inhibition in the way he performed his selection duties. Since Mengele didn't have any actual real doctor work to do in the sham medical unit, he filled his time experimenting on people, and he didn't discriminate. He liked experimenting on anybody he found interesting, but his favorite were his twins. Mengele, his lab, his experiments, his findings were discussed at great length and in glowing terms at every Nazi get-together in the occupied territories. I think that the difference between Mengele and the other Nazi doctors, or Nazis in general, who didn't want to be at the concentration camps was because these Nazis wanted to be hobnobbing and rubbing elbows with the higher-ups. They wanted to be around these more important Nazis so that they could get their own careers on track. But Mengele knew that by going to Auschwitz, he could do that. That was really his only option. He wasn't that great of a doctor. He didn't really have that much to offer, but he knew if he was set free and released at Auschwitz, that he could, hurt enough people and do enough crazy stuff where something might happen that would be considered a breakthrough, and he would have his name and his life made in Nazi Germany. But there were a lot of these twins, right? A lot of these children, and he couldn't be with them and watch them all the time. And he really couldn't trust the guards or the capos to take care of them, so he found someone to take care of them. He appointed a man named Zvi Spiegel, a Jew and a twin himself, to become the twins' father. Zvi's twin sister Magda had been standing in the line for the gas chamber with her 8-year-old son and her mother when Mengele and her brother approached. Mengele asked her if she was Zvi's twin, and when she said she was, he told her to let go of her son's hand, leave him with her mother, and come with him. He said this nicely, kindly even, with a slight smile. She was taken in by him. He was so nice, so handsome and clean, and she'd surely be reunited with her son again. But a few hours later, as she was wandering the camp looking for him, some people standing nearby pointed to the smoking chimneys and told her, "Your child is in there. Your parents are in there. Your entire family is in there. And one day you will also be there." Zvi was responsible for helping the twins fill out their paperwork when they arrived. Many of them were too young to read or write, so he had to ask them questions about their background, health, and physical characteristics like age, weight, eye, and hair color. These questionnaires were provided by the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, sent by Mengele's good friend von Verschwar, and once they were completed, they were sent out to Berlin. Once, Zvi noticed a pair of twin boys had entered different dates of birth on their forms, and he realized that even though they resembled each other and they were close in age, they weren't twins. Knowing that as soon as this was discovered, they'd be sent to the gas chamber, Zvi changed the dates to match, and he sent a prayer up that his alterations would not be discovered, or all three of them would be going to the gas chamber. After this, the twins would be brought in pairs to see Mengele, to talk to Mengele, and he'd ask them more questions like, where were they from? What did their parents do for a living? And then he would call in his beautiful, blonde Aryan secretary, and she would measure the children while he watched and took notes. He made the twins take off their clothes, and they measured them for hours, their arms, their legs, their heads, their torsos, their noses, their ears, everything, over and over again for hours. Every morning, the twins would be woken up at 6 and hauled outside for roll call. They would stand shivering in the cold and the mud while they were counted. And once it was determined that they were all there, Mengele would order 1 or 2 sets of twins brought to him for experiments. These would happen at different labs that were located on the grounds. One lab was specifically for drawing blood and x-rays, and this would usually be done by Mengeles assistants, who would be Jewish concentration camp prisoners that had been doctors or nurses before they'd been taken by the Nazis. Mengele would sometimes watch. He'd bring little candies for the children, but these blood draws would become very painful, especially when they were happening every day. All the twins had blood drawn from them every single day, especially the little ones whose hands were too small, and they had to have the blood drawn directly from their neck. And there was another lab where the most painful and invasive procedures were done. And then there was the pathology lab, where Mengele would perform his autopsies on his twins after they died from whatever he did to them. Mengele's experiments, scientifically, ethically, morally, in every way, they were pretty much garbage. He didn't care if you were an identical twin or a fraternal twin. He wanted to do the same experiments on you. And as you know, if you're a fraternal twin, you have the same in common with your twin as you do with any other sibling. So studying fraternal twins alongside identical twins is problematic when you're doing twin studies. It just didn't make any sense. He didn't have any rhyme or reason. He didn't have a method. It was just mad science. Let's poke here and see what happens. Let's cut here and see what happens. Now, I had a comment in the first video that said something like, the worst part is what Mengele and other Nazi scientists and doctors did in these experiments that they performed actually ended up contributing to medical breakthroughs. And I'm not going to wholeheartedly disagree with that because I don't know enough about it. And there's no doubt that some of these horrible experiments they performed would end up leading to figuring out something about the human body scientifically that they didn't know before. Everybody gets lucky now and then. The fact of the matter is, speaking about Mengele specifically, what he was doing, there was no way it would lead to anything. He was using subjects that were atypically unhealthy. You wouldn't go into the normal population and find a group of people who had been mistreated to such an extent, malnourished to such an extent. So whatever experiments he was doing to them, they were going to affect these people differently than they'd affect an average healthy person. Additionally, the amount of racial bias that Mengele and his fellow scientists and doctors held in their brains was always going to color the outcome of these experiments. So honestly, I don't trust any research or notes or conclusions that Mengele drew from his experiments, considering that it was his goal and the goal of von Verschwar and the goal of so many others in Germany at that time. 39% of scientists ended up becoming Nazis. So anything that they did was just going to be a means to an end. They weren't going to send something back to Hitler that showed everything he was saying was wrong. their written conclusions were always going to reflect and support the Nazi agenda. Now, this woman, Dr. Karen Magnussen, she was working as von Verschoor's assistant at the Institute, and she was doing her own study on eye color, and she was using rats and rabbits and things to do her experiments on. And she was preparing her study using notes and material provided by Mengele from his very immoral and unethical experiments he was doing on actual people at Auschwitz. He would send her back the eyes of his unfortunate patients. Hedva and Leah Stern, a pair of Mengele's twins, can shine a little light on what exactly Mengele was doing to help Dr. Magnussen's study. They said, quote, "Mengele was trying to change the color of our eyes. One day we were given eye drops. Afterwards, we could not see for several days. We thought the Nazis had made us blind." Mengele was obsessed with eye color, and he wanted to see if you could change the color of someone's eyes by injecting dye directly into their eyes, which is ludicrous. And you'd think that a person who has a PhD, who's a doctor and prides himself on being a scientist, would know that wasn't possible. Many of his human subjects would become permanently blind or develop painful infections in their eyes. He and the Nazis were also fascinated by heterochromatic eye color, where the iris is multicolored. I have heterochromatic colored eyes. All of my kids have heterochromatic colored eyes. Usually they'll call them hazel, but if you look at these eyes, you'll see different colors in the irises, green and brown and blue, all together. Now, these people who had heterochromatic colored eyes, if they came upon Mengele in his selection line, he would have them killed immediately, just so he could remove their eyes and send them back to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And there's nothing really mysterious about this eye condition. It just depends on the concentration, production, and delivery of melanin in the iris. But the Nazis were just so curious about it. So curious. Mengele would also take blood from one twin and inject it into the other, just to see what would happen. He'd put them into isolation cages, sometimes alone, sometimes with their other twin, and he would expose them to external stimuli, just to see what would happen. He infected the twins with viruses, germs, bacteria, to see how long it would take their bodies to fight off the pathogen and get better. Sometimes one twin would survive and the other would die. And usually when that happened, Mengele would then kill the surviving twin so that he could autopsy the twins' bodies side by side and see if they were identical inside as they were outside. Vera Blau remembers that Mengele would perform painful surgeries on her twin sister Rachel. She said, quote, "They would wheel her in and out of the operating room, but she does not remember what they did. She remembers only lights, the big red lights flashing down on her as they were about to operate." If Rachel didn't remember what happened to her in that operating room, she was one of the lucky ones. Survivor Alex Dreckel remembered that Mengele would often perform complicated and painful surgeries while his patients, or victims, were awake and aware. He said, quote, "Once I witnessed a stomach operation. Mengele was removing pieces from the stomach, but without any anesthesia. Another time, it was a heart that was removed, again, without anesthesia. It was horrifying. Mengele was a doctor who became mad because of the power he was given. No one ever questioned him. Why did this one die? Why did that one perish? The patients did not count." Moy Schaffer recalls the horrible things Mengele did to his twin brother, Tibby. He said, quote, "Mengele made several operations on Tibby. One surgery on his spine left my brother paralyzed. He could not walk anymore. Then they took out his sexual organs. After the fourth operation, I didn't see Tibby anymore." No one knew exactly what Josef Mengele was doing in or out of Auschwitz, and many suspect the worst of his experiments are still a secret, which is terrifying. The children had no idea what he was injecting them with, and still to this day, we've no idea what kind of serums and things he was creating were being injected into these people. Twins would be carted off in these fake Red Cross trucks, and they'd never be seen again. A pair of 18-year-old Hungarian twins were of great interest to Mengele for a short while. He brought them in, examined them, measured them, and then shoved tubes into their noses and down their throats, pouring some kind of gas into their lungs. They coughed and they retched so badly they had to be restrained. And when that was done, he collected their saliva to examine. On these 2 men, he also performed other experiments, which consisted of having them dipped into scalding water over and over again, and then placed on tables so their body hair could be plucked out. After being completely destroyed by these experiments, he had them injected in the heart with poison and sent some of their organs back to von Verschwer. They'd been kept alive for 3 weeks after their arrival at Auschwitz, just enough time to completely torture them, break them, and kill them. And for what? What scientific breakthroughs would come from burning them, plucking their hair out, and filling their lungs with gas? Josef Mengele did some truly horrific things to these twins and all the people at Auschwitz. Once he delivered a baby to a woman who was pregnant. He did everything right, even ensuring that the area was clean and sanitary. He cut the umbilical cord, he handed the newborn baby to its mother, and then he ordered them to both be sent to the gas chamber. It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense unless you realize that this was a truly twisted and sick individual. Someone who, in another time, in another place, would have had to have hid his obsession with death and violence. But in Nazi Germany, he could fly his freak flag high and be commended for it, rewarded for it. In one instance, in an idiotic and misguided attempt to create a pair of Siamese twins, Mengele sewed together a brother and sister, twins named Guido and Nina. Not only did he sew them together, but he performed an operation that connected their veins. He had them brought back to their barracks and they were left alone to cry all night as their wounds became more and more infected. Those around them could smell the gangrene as soon as they arrived. These children, not even 4 years old yet, died soon after. But because he kept his evil acts so secret, because very few people who saw his darkest side lived to tell the tale, the twins, who he called Mengele's children, they actually called him Uncle Mengele. He was kind to them. In a gray, dark place full of mean-spirited guards and death all around, he always had a smile or a little treat for his children. They felt that he was their protector in many ways. One night, another doctor, a rival of Mengele's named Dr. Thilo, came into the twins' barracks and he gave the order for them to be sent to the gas chambers. The Germans were losing the war. Things weren't looking good and the executions had been sped up. Their barracks were sealed and guarded so that no one could leave. And Dr. Thilo left feeling he'd accomplished his task, signing a paper that signed the death warrant of Mengele's precious twins. Somehow, Eve, the twins' father, was able to get out of the barracks and run through the camp to Mengele's office, which was very dangerous considering a prisoner was not supposed to be running around by himself. He could have been shot on sight. He managed to get to Mengele and tell him what was happening, which made the doctor very upset, and he immediately called it off. Mengele especially doted on the younger children. He went to the barracks where the twins were held almost every single day to visit them, and he'd, play with them, bring them little chocolates, offer them rides in his car. He even organized soccer games for them. Eyewitnesses said that when he was with the children, laughing and playing, he often was more relaxed and seemed more like himself. One boy specifically was Mengele's favorite. Other prisoners said that this little boy looked very much like Mengele himself, with shining dark hair, bright dark eyes, a round little handsome face. He couldn't have been more than 3 or 4, and Mengele would come sometimes to specifically see him, and he'd scoop him up in his arms and spin him around laughing and kissing his cheek. He'd hold his hand while they walked through Auschwitz, checking on everything, and this little boy and Mengele were so close that when others asked the little boy what his name was, he'd reply, Mengele. Vera Blau, just a child herself at this time, remembered that she felt that Mengele loved the boy very much. And she believed that he loved children in general. She remembers him as a very gentle man. You'll see a lot of this Jekyll and Hyde confusion when it comes to Dr. Josef Mengele. Many will point to the instance of him saving the twins from certain death and him being sweet to the kids. They'll point to that and they'll say, see, he was a good man. There was good parts of him. He just did bad things. He must have been good at some point, but the Nazis ruined him. But I disagree. I think every move he made, every smile he flashed, every little chocolate he handed to these kids, it was all a means to an end. They had to like him. They had to trust him. His whole life, he'd put a great deal of effort into being liked by the townspeople of Günzburg, by his schoolmates, by von Verschuer. If you've ever been in sales, you'll hear the saying that people buy from people they like. Mengele had a whole lot of shit that he wanted people to buy. And his tool for doing this wasn't violence or by force. It was to be nice to people, to be kind to them, to treat them with a scrap of humanity in a place where they'd lost their entire identity. You have to understand, these people, especially these children, they came to this place and they were treated like garbage by everybody besides Josef Mengele. He was a warm smile. He was a piece of candy. He was a light in a very dark place for them. But no one who truly loves children could have ever done to them what Mengele would do. One moment he'd be kissing their heads and handing them a piece of candy. The next he'd be calmly signing a piece of paper that sent them to the gas chamber, sticking needles in their eyes, their necks, their hearts. He didn't love children. He didn't value life. All he valued, all he loved was himself, his career, his aspirations. And I feel like you guys don't hate Mengele enough yet, so I have a couple more stories to tell you. So he managed the infirmary, right? But what he did mostly was just execute the sick and the weak. Eva and Miriam were a pair of twins that he performed many experiments on several days a week. He injected them with many mysterious substances. To this day, Eva and Miriam, they're doctors. They have no idea what was in these substances. But one day, Eva became very sick with a high fever, swelling in her arms and her legs, a rash all over her skin. No one told her what was wrong. No one treated her. They just put her in that infirmary. And Mengele came to visit, and he was kind of looking down at her and laughing with the nurses. And he was like, too bad she's so young. She'll be dead within 2 weeks. And then he walked away. Eva didn't die though. Her body fought back and she recovered. Her sister Miriam had been subjected to dozens of tests, mainly on her kidneys. Although Miriam made it out of Auschwitz, later in life she would develop issues. During her first pregnancy, the doctors discovered that her kidneys had never developed past that of a 10-year-old's, the age she was when Mengele performed experiments on her. And in 1993, she died from a rare form of cancer that is suspected to have been caused by whatever Mengele did to her. Eva was also very sick as she grew into an adult. She suffered losses of pregnancy, and when she finally did have a son, he developed cancer. Eva and Miriam lost their entire family to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And later, Eva would lose her twin from a disease that she most likely would never have gotten if Dr. Mengele hadn't gotten his hands on her. And yet, Eva was able to travel back to Auschwitz and stand next to a former doctor, Hans Munch. And she forgave him. She forgave Mengele. She forgave the Nazis. She needed to forgive in order to be free of the painful weight that had been on her for so long. Eva Moses died in 2019, a passionate and loud voice, not letting anyone forget what happened to her and so many others in the concentration camps. Back to hating Mengele. One day, during a selection, a mother refused to be separated from her 14-year-old daughter. She held on to her, and she scratched an SS guard in the face when he tried to force them apart. In order to solve the problem that had arisen, Mengele took out a gun and shot both mother and daughter. Then he cut the selection short and sent whoever remained to the gas chambers. Then he walked away calmly, whistling, with his hands in his pockets. Another time, the doctors at the camp were arguing whether or not a little boy had tuberculosis, and it was an argument because they'd all become kind of fond of this little boy. He was a favorite. Now, Mengele was one who believed he had TB, and while all the other doctors were arguing over it, Mengele left the room, and he came back a short while later, and he was like, guys, I was wrong. He doesn't have TB. And when they asked him how he knew, he said, well, I wanted to, set this argument straight, so I killed him and I did an autopsy. He was perfectly healthy. Yet another time, there was a typhus outbreak in one of the women's camps. Not everyone was infected, but instead of taking the time to figure out who was and who wasn't infected, Mengele just ordered the entire camp of 600 women to be gassed and their barracks fumigated. The Romani Camp at Auschwitz was also a place that Mengele liked to spend time. He liked to go there and walk through and wave to the children while their families played music and danced. They always played music when Mengele came around because they knew he liked it so much. Their efforts to be likable to Mengele didn't stop him from giving the order to have the camp sealed in August of 1944, when he got word from Berlin that they should all be executed. Mengele also had a little boy in the Romani camp that was one of his favorites, and this little boy was described as being very beautiful and lively, and Mengele would dress him all in white, and once again they would walk around the camp together, and the little boy would dance and sing for Mengele. Mengele got a real kick out of it. When the order came and Mengele sent the entire Romani camp to the gas chambers, he himself went and got this little boy and took him by the hand and walked him through the camp as they so often had. He walked him to the gas chambers and he held his hand until he walked in. Mengele didn't have the problem that a lot of Nazis had, the problem of killing face to face. He didn't mind being front and center while somebody was being murdered, even if this was a child who he developed a bond or an attachment to. He was a serial killer. An eyewitness, a survivor from Auschwitz, remembers that the night the Romani camp was ordered to be sealed, its occupants knew what was coming, and they cried and they wailed all night long. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in that position, knowing that this was your last night alive, clutching your children to you as they slept, and you staying awake all night because you don't want to miss one more second of being able to kiss their skin or touch their hair or smell them or hug them, knowing it's the last time you'll be together before you're all murdered without anyone giving you a second thought. Only 2 weeks after the destruction of the Romani camp, Irene Mengele arrived at Auschwitz to spend 2 weeks there with her husband. Since Mengele's assignment at Auschwitz, they hadn't seen each other all that much, but they'd been able to spend enough time together to conceive a child, a little boy named Rolf, who'd been born on March 16, 1944. Irene's visit to the death camp is often a point of debate. Did she know what was going on there or not? I believe she did. As soon as she arrived, she commented on the horrible smell. She said the whole time it was there, and she could never escape it. Irene and Josef strolled hand in hand through some nearby fields. They picked berries, they had picnics, they went swimming and behaved as a typical young couple would. Although she mentioned later that her husband did seem a bit depressed, overall they seemed to have a very nice time together until she got sick from typhoid fever and she had to be hospitalized at a real hospital, not the filthy room of death and destruction that Mengele was running at the camp. I could tell you a million more stories where it seems like Mengele killed literally just to amuse himself. One time he stopped a new mother from nursing her baby so he could see how long it would take the baby to starve to death. And when the mother killed her own child so that she didn't have to slowly starve to death, Mengele had this mother killed. If a woman did become pregnant, he'd insist on being there when she gave birth, and then she'd immediately have to hand her baby over to Nazi doctors. And she'd never see her baby again. A Polish woman who'd been a midwife before she was imprisoned at Auschwitz tells stories of being ordered to deliver babies and then immediately killed them. She delivered 3,000 babies during her 2 years there, and she refused to do what was requested of her. The system was set up in a way where the woman would deliver a child, the child would legally be declared stillborn, and then they would be drowned in buckets of water. But again, just like in World War I, World War II was not looking good for the Nazis. In January of 1945, the Soviet forces had begun moving deeper into Poland, and they'd already liberated Warsaw and Krakow by the middle of the month. This sparked madness at Auschwitz, and a mad dash to get rid of all evidence of their crimes. That included the people that still lived there. The Gestapo began killing as many people as they could. The gas chambers and the crematoriums could not work fast enough to accommodate those being pushed inside. On January 27th, Soviet troops marched into Auschwitz and were greeted with a sight they would not soon forget. Ivan Martinushkin recalled that when they got there, they had never heard of Auschwitz. They had no idea what to expect, and the reality of what they found was so much worse than anything they could have created in their imaginations. There were only about 7,000 people left, those who were too sick or too weak to be marched out. 10 days before this, the Nazis had evacuated almost 60,000 prisoners and marched them to other camps, what is today known as the Death March. It was January. The temperatures were freezing, and most of these people didn't have shoes or proper clothing. Many who survived this march believe it was almost worse than anything they'd endured at camp. If you stumbled or you fell behind, you'd be shot on the spot. Many times this happened right in the middle of the street while German citizens watched. Some of these Germans tried to help the people walking by, tossing them bread, but if they were seen, the intended recipient of the good deed would be killed immediately. It's believed that out of the 750,000 prisoners who were marched out of their respective concentration camps, between 250,000 and 375,000 of them were murdered before they even reached their destination. One of the men who had left Auschwitz said that out of the 20,000 he'd left with, only 2,000 made it to Mauthausen, a camp in Austria. And Mengele's children, his twins, they were some of the only children to survive Auschwitz. All of the Nazis, including Josef Mengele, had already fled to avoid capture. The few soldiers that were left behind scrambled around trying to get rid of evidence. They started burning all the clothes and belongings that they'd taken off people that they'd killed in the gas chambers. They started trying to destroy the crematoriums. Mengele, however, was too attached to his ludicrous work to destroy the evidence. He sent a lot of his specimens back to Berlin, to von Verschwar, and he gave his notes of his experiments and things like that to a trusted person to keep safe for him. I guess he really thought there was some scientific legitimacy to what he'd done. He also packed up a bunch of slides and notes, and he sent them back to his hometown of Günzburg for safekeeping. And then one night in mid-January, he was just gone. He disappeared. He didn't say a word to anybody. He just vanished. What actually happened was he swapped out his SS uniform for a uniform of the German army, the Wehrmacht. He knew that anyone who'd been a part of the SS or the Nazis in general, they'd be brought to task. They would be the ones that were of most interest to the Allied forces. So he hid in plain sight. He joined up with an army unit, and they would soon surrender to the American army. And when they did, Mengele was among their ranks. So game over, right? Mengele's captured by the Americans. They have him in their hands. Happy ending. He's captured, he's in custody, and he'll pay for his crimes. Unfortunately, no. While in a POW camp in Munich, Mengele was crying about, "Oh, my life, this is horrible. I need to get out of here. I can't be captured here in this camp. Being imprisoned in a camp is awful." And he met up with another Nazi doctor named Fritz Ullmann. And luckily, good old Fritz Ullmann had a plan. Just change your identity. Pretend you're not a Nazi. So Fritz gave Mengele a set of identification papers, his own papers, Fritz's own papers. And all Mengele did was modify the papers a little bit so that instead of Fritz Ullmann, it said Fritz Holman, and Mengele became Fritz Holman. And really, at this point, all the Americans were interested in doing was getting a hold of the high-level Nazis and putting them on trial. In order to weed these men out, they would have to check their armpit for the mandatory blood tattoo that the SS members would have. But remember, Mengele was too vain to get this tattoo. He never did get it. U.S. troops had no idea they'd had such a large Nazi war criminal on their hands, and they let him go. Mengele walked out a free man on August 18th, 1945. He went back to Günzburg, but he couldn't stay with anyone he knew. It was too dangerous. He may have gotten away with it this time, but eventually those who had been his victims at the concentration camp were going to speak his name and point him out. So he hid in the woods, and his family would bring him food and clothes. But he couldn't stay there. It was too dangerous. The Allied forces had set up checkpoints and roadblocks all over Germany, attempting to capture the Nazis who'd fled. When I first was going to do this video, because it was our first Dark History, I just wanted it to be one video so we could get a good handle on what Dark History would be about. But it's like my curse that I can't do it. I find these stories so interesting, so complex, with so many implications. I don't know how to condense it. I don't know how to water it down because I feel like it all won't make sense in the grand scheme of things. So I would like to do a third video. There's so much more that happens now that Mengele has escaped from the Allied forces. What happened to Mengele after he slipped through the Americans' fingers? Did he survive? Was he captured? Was he put on trial? Did he live a good life? Did he ever feel bad about what he did? I really feel like there needs to be a third part because some might say Mengele's story is just beginning. There's so much more. And I've already started researching the third part, so I kind of have, my notes in order. If you guys would like a third part and you want to find out what happened to Mengele when he tries to escape, and it's really interesting, okay? The Mossad's involved. There's like a whole hunt for him. It gets real crazy. If you want a third video on that, then let me know in the comments. I really would like your feedback on that, because if you don't want it, then I'll move on to the next topic, whatever we're talking about next. But if you do want it, then I'll finish researching that so that I can record that video and we can kind of round this whole series of events out. Personally, I think the series needs it to make sense, but it is up to you, because I don't want to be boring you guys and stretching this out if you're not into it. All right, let me know. Check out Magellan TV in the description box. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up yet, to get your free trial now. Let me know what you're watching. Check out all of those documentaries that I suggested at the beginning, because it is very interesting when we're talking about this time period to kind of have additional information to clarify everything. Let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time, whatever that next time is, part 3 of this or part 1 of something else. Have an amazing day. Stay kind and stay beautiful, and I love you. Bye.
Don't break now. And the battle's going straight down.